It has been 5 months since the Russian invasion of Ukraine started. The quick victory that had been anticipated by Russian and Western thinkers has not materialized, and Russia has failed to achieve its main strategic goal in Ukraine, which is to say that it has failed to overthrow the government of Ukraine and install a puppet government in its place. As the days go by, it is made clear that the Russians are bogged down in a war of attrition in Ukraine. And as more Western weapons flow into Ukraine and more sanctions are put onto the Russian economy, it is made very clear that the Russia-Ukraine war would go on for many months to come, or maybe even an entire year. The victims of this conflict are first and foremost the people of Ukraine, but they are not the biggest. The biggest victims of this conflict are the people of the Third World. They will suffer from something that they had nothing to do with. There are many ways in which the Russian war in Ukraine will hurt the global poor much more than they would the global rich. The first way is the price of energy. There has been a dramatic rise in the price of energy around the world, whether it be oil, gas, or coal. These price rises already existed before the war in Ukraine, but they have been sent into overdrive because of the war. Russia is the third largest producer of crude oil and the largest producer of natural gas. Fears of Russian supply being cut due to damaged energy infrastructure because of war, and it being cut through Western sanctions, have led to this astonishing rise in energy prices. Russia produces 10% of Brent crude oil, which has also shot up in value. This has come at a bad time, as countries in OPEC+, which is an oil cartel that control 40% of the world's oil supply, are not able to increase their oil supply to sufficient levels to bring down the energy prices globally. This inability is combined with the cutting off of Iranian and Venezuelan oil supply because of American sanctions, and cutting off of Libyan oil supply because of its currently ongoing civil war. All of this has combined to create a perfect storm that is engulfing the world, especially the Third World. As with any global crisis, people in the Third World will suffer most from it. People from the First World have very high levels of income and, generally, suffer only minor inconveniences in their life when things like these happen. But what may be an inconvenience for someone in the First World is a full-blown disaster for someone in the Third World. And that is precisely what is happening with these energy prices. People in the Third World have low levels of income and generally require government subsidies to be able to afford things like electricity and oil, and now even that is not enough due to this dramatic rise in energy prices. Not only that, but the governments of these countries do not have the fiscal capacities to increase the subsidies in these times of inflation, as they already have substantial amount of debt. The rise in the price of coal, of which Russia exports 18% of, is especially negative since most of the Third World, like India, still uses coal as a major source for domestic power generation. According to BP's statistical report on world energy, published in 2020, 43% of the energy needs of the Asia-Pacific region were met by coal. According to the report, coal provided almost half of Vietnam's energy needs, 43% of Indonesia's energy needs, and in the Philippines it was around 40%. All these countries and their people will face tough times ahead. But high energy prices are the least of their worries, as there is an even bigger crisis coming which threatens to take even food from their table. Russia had long been called the breadbasket of the world. Ukraine in recent years became an agricultural powerhouse for the developing world. Russia's share in global wheat exports is about 18%, whilst Ukraine's share is about 20%. This supply has been disrupted because of the war in Ukraine. In Ukraine, they have been disrupted because of attacks on infrastructure and transport and the blocking of Ukrainian ports by Russia. And in the case of Russia, they have been disrupted by sanctions. All this has led to food price inflation around the world. The price of wheat rose up by 40% globally soon after the invasion of Ukraine. In Africa specifically, the price of wheat rose up by 60%. As stated before, this will disproportionately affect the Third World, as most of the food importers are countries from the Third World. There are around 26 countries that import more than half of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine, countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, Israel, Ethiopia, and Turkey. In cases like that of Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, and Mongolia, all of their wheat is imported from Russia alone. The food crisis is also being intensified due to a shortage of fertilizers, which is another consequence of this war. Russia makes up 17% of the world's global supply of fertilizers, whilst Belarus, a Russian ally, makes up 23% of the world's supply of fertilizers. Last year, Russia and Belarus exported 40% of the world's fertilizers. Due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Belarus' support for it, they have been sanctioned by the West, which is leading to a shortage of fertilizers, which many people believe is much worse than the shortage of food exports, as David Laborde, a senior analyst at Washington D.C. based analyst at International Food Policy Research Institute, put it. The biggest threat the food system is facing is not the disruption, is the fertilizer trade. Wheat will impact a few countries. The fertilizer shortage can impact every farmer everywhere in the world and cause decline in the production of every food, not just wheat. As quoted by The Outlook, the fertilizer shortage will lead to even higher prices for all forms of food, as food production drops everywhere in the world, especially the Third World. All of this is made worse by various countries implementing export controls. It may be enticing to believe that the biggest victims will be Africans, but that is not true. The Africans will be disproportionately affected by the crisis, but the biggest victims of this food crisis will be the MENA countries. The word MENA is an acronym for Middle East and North Africa, and this region and group of countries will be the most affected as they are the biggest food importers in the world. This phenomenon exists because of the simple fact that most, if not all, territory of the countries in that region is desert. From Morocco to UAE, most lands that these countries control is desert. They have little to no rivers or farmlands, and it is because of this they have to import most of their food. That is why countries like Saudi Arabia import most of their food. Whilst some countries in the Middle East are doing well, like UAE and Qatar, because of their low population levels, and the record-breaking prices of oil and gas filling their coffers, other countries are not doing so well. Countries like Lebanon were already going through hyperinflation and an economic crisis when the Russia-Ukraine war started, and all of its global consequences reached their doorstep. According to the UN, over 80% of the country's population lived in multidimensional poverty in 2021. Food price inflation was at 400% in December 2021. This was the state of the country when it was hit by the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022. With the skyrocketing price of energy and commodities, the inflation situation was made even worse. Lebanon procures 75% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine, making the already bad situation even worse. But in Yemen it's even worse. Yemen was already going through hell because of the Saudi-imposed blockade. The blockade has led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people, including children, through starvation and diseases like cholera. Most citizens of Yemen were already going through famine-like conditions even before the Russia-Ukraine war. And even before the hyperinflation of 2021, majority of Yemen's population lives on the verge of famine, with 5.6 million people facing emergency levels of food insecurity and 31,000 experiencing famine-like conditions. Yemen's agricultural sector is also deeply affected by the ongoing civil. This is another reason why the situation is particularly worse there. But the biggest loser of this crisis is Egypt. Egypt is the largest importer of wheat in the world, and Egyptians' wheat consumption is double the global average, at 150 kilograms per capita. Bread which is made of wheat is an important part of the diet of Egyptians, especially of the working poor, yet Egypt is not able to be self-sufficient in agriculture. According to the United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA, Egypt's total wheat production in 2021 was 9 million metric tons, but its total consumption was 21 million metric tons, leaving a 12.3 million metric ton shortfall, which will have to be filled by imports. Egypt imports 60% of its wheat, 85% of which comes from the Black Sea region. I cannot stress how much wheat matters in the Egyptian society. To give you an example, in 1977 the International Monetary Fund mandated that the Egyptian government cut subsidies on wheat, and this led to the infamous 1977 bread riots. The situation got so bad that Anwar Sadat, the then Egyptian president, had to call on the armed forces to intervene to stop the riots. Because of experiences like this, the Egyptian government still heavily subsidizes wheat for its population through the program called Tamween. Under this program, the government spends $3.2 billion subsidizing wheat in the name of stability. The short point of this video is that even though the Western media focuses on the consequences of Ukraine war on the West, the major and most wide-reaching consequences of the war will be seen in the Third World. Energy price inflation and food price inflation will hit Africa and the Middle East in a much harder way than they could ever hit the West, and this fact should be known by everyone.